Welcome to a tour of Victorian London, the world's largest and most powerful city during the 19th century, an era of unprecedented innovation, industrialization, and empire. Using advanced AI technology, we'll be transforming centuries-old engravings and paintings into photorealistic scenes, giving you a true sense of what life was actually like in Victorian London, England. Throughout the Victorian era, from 1837 to 1901, London exploded in size from approximately 1.5 million people to over 6.5 million, making it the largest city in the world. It was the beating heart of the British Empire, home to extraordinary innovation and culture, where Charles Dickens wrote his novels and scientists like Charles Darwin changed how we understood the world. But behind the magnificent buildings and technological marvels lay a city of extreme contrasts. While wealthy families lived in elegant townhouses in Mayfair and Belgravia, hundreds of thousands struggled in overcrowded slums in the East End, where entire families lived in single rooms without proper sanitation. At the end of this video, we'll also show you images of the great smog and industrial challenges brought to life, the darker side of progress that defined Victorian London's transformation. This is the River Thames looking toward the Tower of London and London Bridge in the 1850s. The Thames was London's lifeline, crowded with hundreds of vessels, massive cargo ships bringing goods from across the British Empire, coal barges from Newcastle, timber ships from the Baltic, and passenger steamers connecting different parts of the city. The river bustled with dock workers, sailors, and watermen who made their living from this working waterway. On the north bank stands the ancient Tower of London, a Norman fortress built in 1066 that served as a royal palace, armory, and prison throughout the Victorian era. Beyond it, you can see the multiple bridges spanning the Thames, including the newly rebuilt London Bridge completed in 1831, replacing the medieval bridge that had stood for over 600 years. But the river was far from clean. Raw sewage from over 1 million people flowed directly into the Thames, along with industrial waste from factories, slaughterhouses, and tanneries, creating an overwhelming stench. The summer of 1858 became known as the Great Stink, when the smell became so unbearable that Parliament had to soak their curtains in chloride of lime just to meet. Today, the Thames has been cleaned through modern sewage systems, and the riverside has been transformed into one of London's most desirable areas. This engraving shows St. Paul's Cathedral dominating the London skyline in the mid-1800s. Designed by Sir Christopher Wren and completed in 1711, this magnificent Baroque cathedral was one of the world's tallest buildings at 111 meters. Its iconic dome could be seen from miles away across the low-rise Victorian cityscape. Unlike today's clear views, Victorian London was perpetually shrouded in coal smoke from hundreds of thousands of chimneys, creating the famous London fog, actually polluted smog that sometimes became so thick you couldn't see across the street. The area around St. Paul's was densely packed with medieval streets, crowded with clerks, merchants, street vendors, and messenger boys hurrying between the banks and counting houses of the City of London, Britain's financial center. The narrow lanes were filthy, covered in horse manure from thousands of horses pulling carts, omnibuses, and hansom cabs through the streets every day. Despite the pollution and crowding, St. Paul's remained the spiritual heart of London, hosting royal weddings, state funerals, and services celebrating Britain's military victories across the globe. Today, St. Paul's still stands as one of London's most recognizable landmarks, though it's now surrounded by modern skyscrapers that dwarf Wren's masterpiece. This is the Palace of Westminster, home to the Houses of Parliament. Painted in the 1860s, shortly after its completion, the old medieval palace had burned down in a catastrophic fire in 1834, and architect Charles Barry designed this magnificent Gothic revival replacement, completed between 1840 and 1870. The most iconic feature is the clock tower, now known as Big Ben, though that name technically refers only to the Great Bell inside, not the tower itself. Completed in 1859, the tower stands 96 meters tall, and its 4 clock faces became instantly recognizable symbols of London and British parliamentary democracy. The palace sits directly on the Thames riverbank, and in Victorian times, members of Parliament could arrive by boat to private stairs, avoiding the filthy, crowded streets above. The building housed the House of Commons and House of Lords, where debates shaped laws affecting a quarter of the world's population across the British Empire. The ornate Gothic architecture with its intricate stonework, spires and pinnacles was meant to evoke England's medieval past and project permanence and authority. However, the surrounding area was far less elegant. The neighborhood of Westminster mixed government buildings with poor housing, where working-class families lived in cramped conditions, just streets away from where the Empire's decisions were made. Today, the Palace of Westminster remains the seat of British government and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the most photographed buildings in the world. 200B. This is Trafalgar Square, London's grand public space created in the 1840s to commemorate Admiral Lord Nelson's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. The centerpiece is Nelson's Column, completed in 1843, a 52-meter granite column topped with a statue of the Admiral, guarded at its base by 4 bronze lions added in 1867. The square was designed as a space for public gathering and national celebration, with the National Gallery's neoclassical facade forming the northern boundary. In Victorian times, Trafalgar Square was constantly busy with horse-drawn traffic, street vendors selling everything from roasted chestnuts to newspapers, and crowds of Londoners from all social classes. The square became a popular meeting point and a site for public demonstrations, though authorities sometimes tried to prevent working-class gatherings there. The fountains were added partly for decoration, but also to reduce the open space available for large crowds to assemble. Around the square stood gentlemen's clubs, hotels and businesses catering to London's middle and upper classes. But just a few streets away in the slums of St. Giles and Seven Dials, some of London's poorest residents lived in desperate conditions, creating the stark class divisions that characterized Victorian society. Today, Trafalgar Square remains one of London's most visited public spaces, hosting festivals, celebrations, and the famous Christmas tree donated annually by Norway. This is Hyde Park and the Crystal Palace, the magnificent iron and glass structure built for the Great Exhibition of 1851. Designed by Joseph Paxton, the Crystal Palace was a revolutionary building, over 563 meters long and covering 92.0 square meters, constructed almost entirely of prefabricated iron framework and glass panels. It was built in just 9 months in Hyde Park specifically to house the Great Exhibition, the world's first international exposition. The exhibition showcased over 100 zero-zero-zero objects from around the world, celebrating the industrial, technological, and cultural achievements of the Victorian age. Over 6 million people visited during its 5-month run from May to October 1851, with visitors from all social classes. Queen Victoria visited dozens of times, while working families saved up to buy affordable tickets for special days. Inside, visitors walked through displays of steam engines, hydraulic presses, scientific instruments, textiles, furniture, jewelry, and exotic goods from India, China, and across the British Empire. The building itself amazed visitors. The glass roof soared high enough to enclose full-grown elm trees that had been growing on the site, and sunlight flooded through the transparent walls, creating an almost magical atmosphere. The exhibition was enormously profitable, and the proceeds funded the construction of several major museums in South Kensington, including what would become the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Natural History Museum. After the exhibition closed, the Crystal Palace was dismantled and rebuilt in an expanded form in Sydenham, South London, where it stood until destroyed by fire in 1936. Today, nothing remains of this Victorian wonder except the park where it stood. This is Tower Bridge, one of Victorian London's most ambitious engineering projects. Construction began in 1886 and took 8 years to complete, opening in 1894. The bridge was needed because London's population and commerce had expanded eastward, but a fixed bridge would block the river traffic that was vital to the Port of London's economy. The solution was a combined bascule and suspension bridge. The 2 side spans are suspended, while the center span splits into 2 bascules that can lift up to allow tall ships to pass through. The towers are clad in Cornish granite and Portland stone in a Gothic style to complement the nearby Tower of London, though the actual structure is steel. When it opened, Tower Bridge was the largest and most sophisticated bascule bridge ever built, powered by steam hydraulic engines housed in the base of the towers. The high-level walkways connecting the towers allowed pedestrians to cross even when the bascules were raised, though these were often deserted and eventually closed in 1910 because they attracted pickpockets and criminals. The bridge opened thousands of times per year to let ships pass, a dramatic sight as the massive roadway sections lifted up, temporarily halting all traffic. The surrounding docklands were densely industrial, filled with warehouses, wharves, and the crowds of dock workers who loaded and unloaded goods from ships arriving from around the world. Today, Tower Bridge remains a functioning drawbridge and one of London's most iconic landmarks, though it now opens mostly for tourist vessels, rather than cargo ships. This is the British Museum in Great Russell Street, shown here in the 1850s. Founded in 1753, the museum had recently completed its magnificent Greek Revival facade with its iconic colonnade designed by Sir Robert Smirke, finished in 1852. The museum housed Britain's vast collection of antiquities and treasures gathered from across the globe: Egyptian mummies, the Rosetta Stone, the Elgin marbles from the Parthenon in Athens, and countless artifacts from Assyria, Rome, Greece, and beyond. Victorian Londoners could visit for free, making it accessible to all social classes, though working people often lacked the time or education to fully appreciate the collections. The museum represented Victorian Britain's self-image as a civilizing force, preserving and studying the great civilizations of the past, though many artifacts had been acquired through imperial conquest and colonial extraction. The area around the museum, Bloomsbury, was a respectable middle-class neighborhood of Georgian townhouses, home to scholars, doctors, and professionals, a world away from the desperate poverty of the East End slums just a few miles away. The museum's reading room, completed in 1857 with its magnificent circular design, became one of the world's great centers of scholarship where Karl Marx researched Das Kapital. Today, the British Museum remains one of the world's most visited museums, though debates continue about whether its imperial-era acquisitions should be returned to their countries of origin. This is the Royal Exchange in the heart of the City of London, the financial center where merchants, bankers, and traders conducted business. The building shown here is the Third Royal Exchange, designed by Sir William Tite, and opened by Queen Victoria in 1844, after the previous building burned down. The grand neoclassical facade with its imposing portico and Corinthian columns projected wealth and permanence. Inside, the trading floor bustled with hundreds of merchants making deals, exchanging news from across the empire, and negotiating the commerce that made London the world's financial capital. The surrounding square was perpetually crowded with clerks rushing between banks, insurance companies, and trading houses, messengers delivering documents, and street vendors selling newspapers, food, and refreshments to the business crowd. The City of London was unique. By day, it teemed with hundreds of thousands of workers, but at night it emptied as workers returned to their homes in other parts of London, leaving the streets eerily quiet. The wealth generated in these few square miles of banks and trading houses was staggering, financing railways across continents, trade networks spanning the globe, and the industrial enterprises that made Britain the world's dominant economic power. Yet the clerks and workers who made this system function often lived in modest or poor conditions, working long hours for modest wages, while the merchants and bankers grew wealthy. Today, the Royal Exchange building no longer functions as an exchange but houses luxury shops and restaurants, while the City of London remains Europe's leading financial center. This is the Thames Embankment under construction in the 1860s, one of Victorian London's greatest engineering achievements. Designed by engineer Sir Joseph Bazalgette, the project reclaimed land from the river to create new roads along both banks of the Thames while hiding massive sewers underneath. For centuries, London's sewage had flowed directly into the Thames, creating health hazards and terrible smells. After the Great Stink of 1858 made the problem impossible to ignore, Bazalgette designed a comprehensive sewer system, featuring 100 miles of underground brick tunnels that intercepted sewage and carried it downstream to treatment plants away from central London. The embankment construction involved building granite walls into the river to contain the new sewers, then filling behind them to create new land for wide roads, gardens, and public spaces. The Victoria Embankment, completed in 1870, also carried an underground railway line and utility pipes for gas and water. The project transformed the riverside from muddy banks and slums into elegant promenades lined with plane trees, gas lamps, and benches where Londoners could stroll and enjoy the river. Bazalgette's sewer system was so well designed that much of it is still in use today, over 150 years later. The embankment also helped reduce cholera outbreaks that had periodically devastated London when sewage contaminated drinking water. Today, the Thames Embankment remains a major thoroughfare, and the sewer system Bazalgette built continues to serve London, though it's now being supplemented with additional capacity to handle the city's growth. This is Regent Street, one of Victorian London's most fashionable shopping destinations, painted in the 1860s. Originally designed by architect John Nash in the 1810s, 1820s, with its distinctive curved colonnade, the street connected Regent's Park to the north with the royal residence at Carlton House. By the Victorian era, Regent Street had become synonymous with elegant shopping, lined with prestigious shops, drapers, milliners, jewelers, and department stores catering to the upper and middle classes. Ladies in crinolines and bonnets, gentlemen in top hats and frock coats, and their servants carrying parcels crowded the pavements, browsing window displays of the latest fashions and luxury goods. The street was perpetually busy with horse-drawn carriages, omnibuses, and hansom cabs moving slowly through the traffic. Gas lamps lit the street at night, making it one of the few places in London where affluent Victorians felt comfortable being out after dark. The shops were worlds away from the street markets and pawnshops that served working-class Londoners in other parts of the city. Shopping on Regent Street was a social activity as much as a practical one, a place to see and be seen, to display wealth and taste, and to participate in the consumer culture that Victorian prosperity had created. However, the elegant shoppers rarely thought about the shop assistants who worked 12 14-hour days, 6 days a week for modest wages, or the seamstresses and factory workers who produced the goods in cramped workshops and sweatshops. Today, Regent Street remains one of London's premier shopping destinations, though Nash's original colonnade was demolished and rebuilt in the early 1900s. This is the East End of London, specifically an area like Whitechapel or Spitalfields in the 1880s, showing the harsh reality for Victorian London's working poor. While the West End boasted elegant squares and fashionable shops, the East End was overcrowded, impoverished, and notorious for crime and desperate conditions. Entire families lived in single rooms in crumbling tenement buildings, often with 10 or more people sharing a space without running water or proper sanitation. The streets were narrow, dark, and filthy, with open sewers, piles of refuse, and the constant smell of decay. Many East Enders worked in the docks, in sweatshops producing cheap clothing, in match factories with dangerous chemicals, or in casual labor that provided irregular income. Women and children worked alongside men, often in dangerous conditions for pennies per day. Tuberculosis, cholera, and other diseases spread rapidly in the overcrowded conditions, and infant mortality rates were tragically high. Pubs, gin palaces, and pawnshops dominated every corner, as alcohol offered temporary escape, and pawning possessions provided emergency cash when families couldn't afford food. Charitable organizations and religious missions tried to help, but the scale of poverty overwhelmed their resources. The contrast between the East End and the wealthy West End was one of Victorian London's defining characteristics, existing just a few miles apart, yet separated by vast gulfs of wealth, opportunity, and life expectancy. Today, much of the Victorian East End has been demolished and rebuilt, though some areas still show traces of their 19th century past. This is King's Cross and St. Pancras railway stations, the magnificent terminals built in the 1850s-1870s that connected London to the industrial north and Scotland. King's Cross Station, completed in 1852, featured an elegant facade with its distinctive twin arched roofs covering the platforms. Simple, functional, and revolutionary in its use of iron and glass. Next to it, St. Pancras Station, completed in 1868, showcased the ornate Gothic Revival style with the spectacular Midland Grand Hotel forming its facade, designed by George Gilbert Scott. These stations were gateways to modernity. Steam locomotives arrived and departed constantly, bringing coal from Newcastle, manufactured goods from Manchester, and passengers from across Britain. The railways had transformed British society, making travel faster, cheaper, and accessible to ordinary people for the first time. However, the construction of railway lines into central London had required demolishing thousands of working-class homes, displacing poor communities with little compensation. The companies deliberately chose routes through slum areas where property was cheap and resistance minimal, pushing the displaced residents into even more overcrowded conditions in neighboring areas. The stations themselves were constantly crowded with travelers from all social classes: first-class passengers in luxurious compartments, third-class passengers in basic wooden carriages, workers commuting to jobs, and country people visiting the great city for the first time. The area around the stations was perpetually busy with porters, cab drivers, street vendors, and the homeless seeking shelter in the station's covered spaces. Today, both stations remain major railway hubs, with St. Pancras now hosting the Eurostar terminal connecting London to continental Europe. By the end of Queen Victoria's reign in 1901, London had transformed from a Georgian city into a sprawling modern metropolis. The gaslight that had illuminated Victorian streets was being replaced by electric light. Horse-drawn transport was giving way to motorized vehicles and electric trams, and the first deep-level electric underground railways were beginning to operate. Yet the extreme inequalities that defined Victorian London, the contrast between wealth and poverty, between the grand public buildings and the squalid slums, would continue well into the 20th century. The Victorian era gave London many of its most iconic landmarks and established it as a global city, but it also revealed the human costs of rapid industrialization and imperial wealth built on inequality. If you enjoyed this journey through Victorian London, please comment below what city and what era you'd like to see next, and your hometown may be featured in the next video. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the past. Q200B.